welcome to This is Horror Podcast. I am Michael David Wilson, and today we have a special episode in which we are going to be discussing some of the stories from Stephen King's latest collection, You Like It Darker. Now, it was published a few months ago, back in May 2024 by Scribner. And to join myself and Bob Pastorella, we have fellow podcaster and literary horror scholar Neil McRobert of Talking Scared podcast. How are you doing today, Neil?
I'm all right. It's very late here, but I'm a night person, so all is well. How are you? Thanks for having me, etc., etc.
Yeah, I'm doing good. I'm excited to talk about some of these stories. I mean, I'd like to talk about all of them in depth, but people who have listened to the Story Unboxed episodes that myself and Bob do, it would probably be a 24-hour kind of marathon if we were to do them justice. And we haven't got time to record that. It's very late for you. It's very early for me. But I think what we're going to do is going to be something pretty special for people. We've came up with our top stories in the collection, and it was quite interesting when we shared them with one another how much overlap there was.
Yeah, I've had a strange journey with this book because, well, we'll get into all this, but I like it a great deal, and the stories that I love are still the stories that I love. And the stories that I think are my least favourite are largely still my least favourite, but the middle bit has really shifted around. In my opinion, as I've talked about it and reread some of the shorter stories, I've got kind of different opinions, but I've got a very firm top three.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, do you know how many times you have reread the collection, or perhaps there are certain stories that you've reread more than others?
Well, I read it once because I got a copy of this back in I don't know, I got like an early advance copy from Hodder, and I think I read it in April, maybe early April. So it's actually been quite a while since I read it properly. So it feels like it's only just come out, but it's quite a few months ago, and I have no memory of this sort of thing. So I've reread it, some of the shorter stories again, more recently, and I've reread my favourite story in the collection that I will give away at the appropriate juncture. But yeah, I've read it all the way through once, and in parts a second time.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you mentioned the shorter stories because, I mean, this almost feels like a collection of two types of stories because you've got his very short stories, things like Red Screen and the Turbulence Expert, and of course, The Fifth Step. But then you've also got these novellas like Two Talented Bastids and The Answer Man, Dreamers, Rattlesnakes, Danny Coughlin's Bad Dream. And all of these really, they could be standalones if King had chosen to do that. Not just in terms of length, but also in terms of quality and what they're bringing to the table. So this is a remarkable collection.
Yeah, I'm not particularly sure why he's published it the way he has, actually, because I think, let me think, you could fully imagine Two Talented Bastids, Danny Coughlin's Bad Dream, Rattlesnakes, and The Answer Man being, the thing that only King really does, that four novella collection thing that he's rolled out over the years. Because I think if he did those four together, it would be a collection worthy to sit alongside Different Seasons, which for me is one of the absolute high points of his entire career. And I think those four stories collected would, I'll put it a different way, perhaps they would be closer to 4 Past Midnight, not quite Different Seasons, but only one rung down.
Oh no, only 4 past midnight. What?
Mm.
Like they're both remarkable. I don't think it's much of an insult to be like it wouldn't be this world class book, but it might be this other
Yeah.
world class book. And like I wanted to talk about kind of general impressions and how we kind of feel about this. I do feel, and perhaps particularly because it opens with Two Talented Bastards, that this could only have been written at this stage in Stephen King's life. It feels like, the horror stories written by somebody who is well into their career. And I mean that in terms of thematically what he's exploring. And yeah, I found that like that it feels like there's some autobiography, particularly in Two Talented Bastards, which we will get to in due course. But I mean, how was it for the both of you?
What I kind of echo what Neil was saying about that. It's strange that we have these short stories and these novellas. I don't think I really don't think he's done that before. Um, that I can think of. I mean, he's had definitely some novelettes probably with his collections. And confession time. I have not read Four Past Midnight. I know, don't throw rocks at me, but so sorry. There's too many books. He put out more since he's retired. But the I think that some of the caliber of the stories definitely match different seasons. In terms of the way he's presenting the story, and in terms of theme and things like that, I hold different seasons in extremely high regard. That is probably some of the absolute best writing that Stephen King has ever done. So I am, in awe of different seasons. I've gone to it many, many times as inspiration for my own work, and so um, seeing these nice novellas in this collection, it, it felt like to me almost like a breath of fresh air. It's like, hey, you get some short stories, you get some little longer stories, you get something that's got some real meat on the bones too, and I felt that's actually pretty cool. I don't know if that was a marketing decision, if that was a Stephen King decision. um that's but I found it very refreshing to have a lot of variety there.
So somebody pointed something out to me. One of my listeners, can't remember who else I would credit them, and they said that I can't remember the exact details of this, but the last time King brought out short story collections, they've always been followed by huge works. So I can't remember the exact schedule of this, but it's something like Everything's Eventual was followed by the almighty run towards the end of the Dark Tower. Just After Sunset was followed by maybe 11/22/63, um, and Bazaar of Bad Dreams was followed by Sleeping Beauties. So I wonder, rather than this being a sort of editorial decision, whether he's working on something massive and he's just gone, I need some breathing room. So let's get whatever stories I've written in the last however many years, whatever I've written, put them together because I need some breathing room. I wonder if this is just a sort of what in a lesser writer's work would be the sweepings of the office floor, but with him is a set of amazing stories, but nonetheless a kind of way of buying some space to work on whatever he's working on.
It's certainly a possibility. And I mean, I think as well, if we look at these stories, a lot of them have been written post COVID. That is obvious from the content and the references. And if you look at the word count of some of these novellas, I mean, it really goes to show just how prolific, Steve King is. I mean, for him to have these that he's written possibly for some breathing room. We're speculating here, of course, but my goodness, I mean, this would have been a productive few years, to have this output for any author. But goodness, if he's working on something the size of the Stand or approaching that, then that is very exciting, because it has been a while since we've had a work of that size come out from Steve.
Yeah. Fingers crossed. That I know no more than my idle speculation, but I always hope.
Although, because now you've had Stephen on the show a couple of times, I wonder, do you ever worry that, you might say something and it's just your idea, just your thoughts, it came from nowhere, and then a magazine or a newspaper will be like, oh, renowned Steve King expert, or best British friend of Steve King says this is coming.
I think I'm spared that level of fame and notoriety, to be honest. No one knows who I am outside of a few thousand people in the horror community. But when he came on the first time and sort of idly mentioned that he had a musing for a third Talisman book, that got picked up by a lot of people. And that did the rounds. So I sometimes feel maybe I've crowbarred him into the corner where he has to write the Talisman book. And if that's my offer into the world, then I'll stand by it.
Yeah, that's a pretty great offering.
Mm-hmm.
And before we jump into the stories, I just want to give a quick mention to how great the cover is. And, at first, it looks like it's just this island with some palm trees. But then, when you look at it properly, it's like, oh, that's an alligator. And then, of course, and in fact, there's some lightning bolts in the sky as well. So those are both very subtle references to things that happen in stories in this book that you will only get once you've read them.
It took me a good few weeks of looking at that cover online to realise that was an alligator. I just didn't pick up on that at all. But I've got the UK cover, which also I think looks quite banal until you've read Rattlesnakes, and then suddenly it becomes a whole damn sight more chilling,
Oh, God.
I must admit, I think I possibly prefer the American cover, although I don't know. I quite like the brightness of this. I quite like that it's got like that Florida-centric thing, because it makes a nice change for King. But for listeners who can't see this, basically there are two deck chairs on a beach, empty deck chairs, and the sun is projecting a shadow onto them as if people are sitting in those deck chairs. And I think that is a reference to certain things lurking in Rattlesnakes.
Yeah. I think
when
so too.
When I got the book, I bought the ebook, and I was showing my coworkers at work, and they said, "Oh, what is that? Is that the new Stephen King book?" I said, "Yeah, it's a short story collection." And my initial thoughts were, as soon as I seen the cover, I was like, "Glenn, look at this crap cover that they put on there." I was like, "What has this got to do with anything? That's an alligator. Holy shit!" And I was just like, "Oh wow, okay, this is a lot darker than I expected it to be." Okay, so now I see it, and I was like, "That's actually pretty crafty." But it took me several times looking at it, like you, Neil, to realize that was an alligator. And it feels like these are more of his Florida locale stories.
Yeah.
Because I think he's like, I guess Steve is living in Florida and Maine, during different parts of the year. And I feel this, after reading the whole, collection, I was like, these are kind of like his Florida stories, to some extent. And I thought that's pretty cool. It's getting away from the Maine, the East Coast, and getting into Florida. The humidity, the heat, the alligators, the mosquitoes. I mean, it's just there's a lot going on there, beyond what Florida is typically known for, especially lately. If you're looking at political climate, but actual, living climate. I've been to Florida several times, and it's pretty nice there. Um, that's I just think it's really cool.
All right. Well, let's shift towards the first story that we're going to talk about. And this is my top story of the collection. It's also Neil's top story of the collection. And I know that it's one that, narrowly missed out on Bob's top three. So this is a highly regarded story. Neil, why don't you kick us off, reveal what is that story, and tell us a little bit about it?
So it's the last story in the collection, and it's called The Answer Man. And I would say it edges out everything else, but it doesn't. It beats everything else by leaps and bounds. There are other stories in this collection that I think rank along some of King's best work in the last decade. But I think The Answer Man ranks along some of King's best work ever. And it's, well, how to describe this? I was on another podcast talking about this story, and I suddenly realised that if I was to synopsize it, then I've got to tell the entire thing because it's essentially the story of a life. So I won't do that. I'll talk a bit more thematically. But it begins in the sort of the sharp end of the Great Depression, which I love when King does period. I love when King does sort of early 20th century period, 1922, stuff like that. I think he's got a knack for it that he doesn't use enough. So it's 1937. We've got this character called Phil Parker. That everyman name I don't think is particularly accidental. He is just an everyman. He's sort of white collar family, law firm, etc. He wants to go his own way. He's a bit of a romantic, and he does, and he moves to rural Maine to the chagrin of his parents and his in-laws, and he marries and he starts a practice, and he's a rural Maine lawyer, kind of charm life. And then one day he's driving home and he sees a sign at the side of the road that simply says, the answer man, answer any questions for a certain amount of money. And he pulls over and he thinks this guy is like a fraud or a huckster or whatever. But it turns out this guy is something else entirely. And we never know quite what the answer man is. But for a sum of money, he will answer as many questions as you can ask in 5 minutes. But the questions have to be strict yes or no answers. And then it basically turns into a sort of benign Faustian pact where he doesn't so much give his soul, but he gives away some degree of autonomy, because the question that arises is, to what extent are we free if we know the answers to the big questions? Or to put it another way, what comes first, the answer or the question? If the answer man says, if Phil says, if I do this, will this happen? And the answer man says no or yes, is he right, or is his answer guiding your action so that it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy? And it's, that question is never really answered. And from there on, he meets the answer man again at various points in his life, and it's a story of Phil's life that's marked by love and loss and success and tragedy, and there is no horror aside from the everyday horror of mortality and grief. And it's just a beautiful, beautiful story about a kind of ordinary man living an ordinary life with this very singular, extraordinary figure lurking somewhere in the margins. I just think it's so beautiful and so sad.
Yeah, I just wanted to return to a detail you said where you said that he can only ask the answer man yes or questions that have a yes or no answer.
Yeah.
So it was a little different. He was told, yeah, you can't ask, should I do this? So he can give more than just yes or no. So I mean, one of the times in which Phil is trying to realize, okay, is this guy a huckster? He asks, what's the maiden name of my mother, for example. And he only asks that because the answer man suggests that as a question. So
you're right. Yeah, you're right. But it can't be a sort of advisory. It can't be a
yeah.
qualitative answer. Yeah, it's got to be a sort of firm, factual, binary answer, I suppose. Yeah, you're quite right.
Yeah, yeah. I just wanted to point that out so we
Mm.
don't have listeners pointing it out for us. But I mean, it's such an interesting story too, because I mean, there's so many remarkable like comments on people in general and whether we actually want the answers that we supposedly seek, and then the potential benefits and indeed the damage and of receiving those answers. And one of the things that the answer man says when talking about smart people is he says, I've often wondered if smart people realize what answers they seek in life. And that there's so much to philosophically ponder in this one as well. I mean, this was not only a remarkable story, but it's one that kind of gets you thinking about, yeah, what on earth would you do in this situation? Would you believe in the answer man that this is to be real? Would you then alter your life based on the answers? And you know, we, it's interesting too that this is a story that takes place over the span of Phil Parker's lifetime, as you said. And this is also the story in the collection that took King the longest to write. So he started this in 1977, but he only completed a few pages of it. And I believe it was when his nephew then found it amongst old papers and old stories, and he presented it to Steve King and asked him if he would complete it. And here it is. But I feel that perhaps it needed almost like a decades of experience and of life experience to be able to do this one justice. So, we sometimes abandon stories and think that's it, or why did I abandon this one? But actually, it needed that time to be able to write it fully.
Well, one of the things about this collection as a whole is the reckoning with grief. And I actually think that King has always had an absurdly mature reckoning with grief. I used to say about The Great Gatsby, this sounds like a really weird segue, but bear with me. I used to say about The Great Gatsby, that novel is only a classic if you read it when you're old enough to understand regret. And I think there are certain things that you only really understand when you mature into them. And I think for the vast majority of people, true grief and loss is one of them. And I know there are a lot of children who experience awful loss, but I think it takes a sort of adult loss to really be able to understand the nature of grief. I think kids feel it, but to understand it, I think you have to. Maybe I'm wrong. What the hell do I know? But the point I'm trying to make is that I think King has always had a very, very profound creative grasp of grief. Way back in Night Shift, he wrote The Woman in the Room about essentially his mother dying. And he writes so well about grief. And now we've got this kind of in vogue thing of grief horror. People like Claire McLeod Chapman do it amazingly. But grief horror has become almost a subgenre of its own. Whereas I think grief is horror. I don't think it requires a fencing off or a subgenre. I think grief is horror and horror is grief. But King, this is the first time that I really think he's made it the heartbeat of a collection, because you've got Two Talented Bastids has a degree of grief to it. Rattlesnakes has grief to it. Like I can't think what the phrase is, but like grief within a marriage, and there's grief in this, and I wonder, and it sounds morbid, I wonder, rather than reckoning with his own mortality, if King is starting to reflect upon his wife's mortality because it's such an emergent theme in so many of these stories, the loss of your partner.
Yeah, yeah, you're right. I mean, it occurs again and again within this collection, and multiple times, even just in this story, the Answer Man. There are times where he is confronted with grief. I mean, even early on, there's the impending nature of war, and in fact, I mean, when he comes to the Answer Man to begin with, I mean, he's got numerous concerns and worries on his mind, concerns that he wasn't able to tackle through drinking a crate of beer one night. He couldn't even, solve them after just drinking ginger ale sober the the night after. And so when he comes to the Answer Man, I mean, he has like almost the kind of, it's not quite grief, but the worry that if he makes the wrong decision at this point, that he might lose his relationship with his fiance, with his future wife, because he wants to start this new rural law firm, which you mentioned before, but and like there's this new up and coming area. He thinks that there's a real opportunity for money to be made, but his family and his father-in-law in particular, they want him to join this family law firm. And if he makes the wrong decision, if he goes against their wishes, there is that worry that he's going to be ostracized from his fiance's side of the family, and thus the relationship might collapse. So even early on, we've got that. I think as well, something that's interesting that you mentioned was, of course, he has to pay to get these answers. The Answer Man will answer as much as possible in 5 minutes, and there is this fee, but the fee changes. And actually, the Answer Man says early on, with regards to the fee, I charge what the traffic will bear. So he likes to think about, how much do you need this answer? And also, what is it going to cost you to hear it? So I thought that was a very interesting element as well. Particularly, I mean, we've got this supernatural entity, the Answer Man. I think that's pretty clear. I mean, he even says like other people can't see him. He's kind of in like these fragments, this slip between time. So the money is not really for the Answer Man. He has no need for earthly material wealth, but actually it's for Phil, and it's for whoever goes to visit him, because this is going to cost you greatly, some of this information. And I mean, we can assume the Answer Man, he has no concept of time. Time always is the future, past, present. It's always there. So he knows what you're going to ask, and he knows what must be charged accordingly. And I think the second time that he visits the Answer Man, I mean, we're told early on he visits 3 times. It's pretty shattering what he finds out.
Yeah. As for the money, though, I think what you're saying is right. It's not the money is not for him. It's about Phil. But the alternative way is that maybe even in the outer darkness and the places between worlds, inflation is still a bitch.
Yeah, I would say the price has been adjusted for inflation.
Yeah.
And it flows across the veil. I think it's interesting too, because like the first like series of questions that are asked are questions that primarily to not like make it too general, but they're questions about the future. And so they're questions about success, things that young people concern themselves with. You know, as we go along, the questions become more personal about, like the second time they're more personal. They're about, the people that Phil cares for. And then your final round is more of basically I'm at the end. I feel like that I've he's I guess wanting confirmation of a life well lived, and that was my impression of it. Um, and this is like this was not. I don't think this one was in my top three, but I liked it. I still did. Um, because I'll always like these kind of philosophical stories that he does, and they make you think beyond the words on the page, and that's a lasting power of good writing.
I just love when King gets in this groove, and I struggle for articulation, but it's something about the longevity of the story. It's something about the kind of Norman Rockwell-ism of it. It's such Americana. It's gentle, but it has teeth. It's just the teeth aren't attached to a monster; they're just attached to life itself. It's a story that in this is the most different season story in the book, and it has the tonality of something like The Body. And even though it's taking place at the other end of a lifetime, because it's essentially, even though it's about Phil all the way through, it's really about Phil's old age and him looking back as much as looking forward. So it's the other end of that spectrum, The Body, but it feels like that same sunlit, sepia-toned, warm-hued King that I love. Contrary to the fact that we're all supposed to be horror fans, I love when he does this stuff more than any monster he could ever write. It's the parts in it that I love are never the parts with Pennywise. They're always the parts with the kids living their lives in the barrens. I love King doing it's not magical realism, but it's like it's American realism with an otherworldly tinge. I just love it so much. It makes me feel warm and home.
Yeah, and it does, and I think it's a good contrast too, especially in his actual true horror stories and horror novels, because you kind of need that feeling. And I mean, a good writer is going to realize, if I can make you feel this way, this warmth, then when I hurt my characters, you're going to feel that too. And it's a good juxtaposition on that. It's something to be mindful for in your own writing, that you have to you've got to contrast the dark with light, or you're not going to have any you're just going to be pitch black. Which, I mean, there's stories that are like that, sure, and they're pretty good, but I like the contrast a lot better.
And it's interestingly placed in the collection as well at the end, because it could easily be seen as a coda. It's the kind of thing that you just limp to the finish line with. But I ever think about, it's not a novelty. This is this idea, but short story collections are like albums, and the story placement matters. And one of the stories we're going to talk about, I think, from you, Michael, my problem with it is the placement in the collection more than anything else. But you've got these last three big chunky stories. You've got Rattlesnakes and The Dreamers, which are two of his most, head-on confrontations with true horror that he's written in a minute. And then The Answer Man comes in, kind of like the hidden track at the end of the album, with like the pared back guitar and, Alanis Morissette at the end of Jagged Little Pill singing that lament about, watching her lover in the shower. Sorry, I'm getting a bit niche and geeky now. But it feels like that, like this gem right at the end when you least expect it, and it like wounds your heart because your guard is down. You've just read The Dreamers and you think, oh, I know what King can do with monsters under the bed. And then, Jesus, what he can do with just an old man missing his wife. Fuck.
Yeah, and when you talk about the placement in the collection, I mean, I can't see another way they could have ended this one. I mean, this is the perfect ending. It's the best ending in terms of like story structure and completeness to any other stories in this book, in my opinion. It's just so perfectly formed. And I mean, we will have said at the start of the show that we will have somewhat spoilers in this, but we'll try not to go so specific that it renders, reading the story useless. But you know, the final questions are ones that are concerned with not just death, but the beyond and the afterlife. And
And the answer
goodness,
to all of them is yes.
I
And
know, and that's
I,
so.
I still don't know what it means, but that doesn't frustrate me. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because it feels like we're not supposed to have answers to those questions, right? That's the human condition. We're not supposed to know the answer to those questions that he asks at the end. And it's almost like Phil can't know, and we as the readers can't know. Yeah, it's beautiful. There's a poetry to it that I don't fully.
Yes.
I couldn't express it on the page and how that it works, like the logic of all the answers at the end being yes, because it's illogical because they're antithetical questions, but the answers are always yes, and that just makes sense on a kind of cosmic level.
I think the answers being yes, the perfect answers, as you say, there's a poetry, there's a beauty, there's a completeness to it. And I mean, I don't think we're meant to be looking to put it all together and be like, this is the definitive reading of those answers. But the way that I can kind of come to terms with these seemingly paradoxical yeses is, if you can conceive of it, if you can believe it, then you can manifest it into being. So if this is what you conceive of, if this is what you want, then yes, yes. And also it's like the afterlife, it's everything and more.
Yeah.
It's what you can't conceive too. It's just a perfect ending.
It is, yeah. And it's a special brain that can think it up, because if you sat me down and asked me to write this question, I guarantee I would never come up with that ending. There's something, that's the magic. That's the magic.
Well, I mean, often when we discuss stories, I like to kind of be a little bit indulgent and ask people, what they would do in these situations. So, I mean, firstly, from the beginning, if you see a sign that even says that, you can go and see the answer man, are you pulling over? Are you curious enough to see what's going on there?
Well, it's a weird one, right? Because I actually thought about this, because I am an very, very anti spiritualist person. I don't mean anti-spiritualist, and if you've got a spiritualism, crack on. I can't stand mediums, right? I think they are hucksters and frauds and parasites. Sorry to any medium listeners, but I do, and they make me angry in the audacity of what they do. But at the same time, I absolutely love anything weird by the side of the road, and I will stop for anything weird at the side of the road. So I don't know. It's a rock and a hard place, that one. I'm not a driver. My wife drives. If I said to my wife, "Can we pull over and talk to the answer man?" she'd be like, "Absolutely not. We're in a rush. Be quiet." So that would take care of it.
Yeah, yeah. So you have to take the other leap to imagine that you're driving and, and you don't have
Which, quite
your
frankly, is a far bigger fiction than a man being able to answer any question. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. How about you, Bob? Are you pulling over?
Absolutely not. No way. Yeah. I've seen enough of that growing up. There was down this area that was basically like a little kind of residential commercial area where they had some, a lot of houses, but they also had like little corner stores and things like that. Growing up, we had this lady who was, I mean, and it's probably a franchise. It's like Madame Dora, medium spiritualist, had a big billboard in front of her house, and we kept passing that up, and I never even asked my family about it. I never asked them, because I remember seeing this when I was a kid. But I remember when we were driving through one day, and my mom said, "I wonder if she's really busy." And my dad was driving, and he just shook his head. He didn't say a word. He was just like, "No, no." And I don't know. I think I get a lot of that skepticism from him because he, as much as he kind of, helped me and guided me through my early horror, entertainment. He was pretty much, a skeptic like me. And, I think I'm a little bit more of the, I tend to lean to, I want to believe, but you got to really kind of prove it to me. Something like that on the side of the road, I would just keep on going, man. I just, I feel like that would be a waste of time and my money. The concept of do I want to know? Man, I can't really, I can't articulate an answer on that. There's some things in my life that I would want to know, but there's also things in my life that I would like to be surprised about.
I don't
And
think anything good comes of knowing anything.
I'm kind of like you. But there's some things that I would want to know. Probably not about me, but maybe about other people. Um, people I care about, and I don't know.
I just think
It's a tricky thing.
anything at all, I think, apart from like what are the lottery ticket numbers, but I don't think he's going to tell you that. I
Yeah.
think anything unavoidably, irretrievably, will steal the joy from the future and impose the terror of the future. I don't think there's any other outcome than that. Because, will I make $1 million writing a book one day? Well, if I already know, where's the joy? Am I going to
Right.
die? Am I going to die in pain? Like, yes, great. I'll look forward to that then, in however many years. I just don't think anything good comes. It's supposed to be chaos. It's supposed. This is getting very philosophical. It's late at night here, but I just think life is supposed to be. It's supposed to be meaningless. I think, apart from the friends we made along the way, I don't think it's some kind of teleological linear narrative that we're supposed to be able to see in that way. So I don't want to know anything deep down in my gut. I don't want to know.
Yeah, well, both of you have anticipated what the next question would be, which was, supposing you did stop, what, if anything, would you ask the answer man? I mean, I suppose it would be funny if you stopped and then didn't ask anything. You just look at him, you shake your head.
Yeah.
Not today, answer man. But yeah, I mean, I've been pondering on this because I think there are a lot of things that at a glance, we feel like we would like to know that. But then the deeper we consider it, the more we realize there could be disaster in having that knowledge. I mean, so there's a lot of truth to the cliche that ignorance is bliss. And I think if we start asking anything about death or about our family, that is a surefire way to absolutely destroy your life now, because then you're going to be just kind of consumed by that knowledge. Um,
And if you
you
get
know,
good news, you're going to be a dick, right? Because someone says
I
like, yeah, you're not going to die like doing this, and you're going to be a dick, right? Because the degree of caution is useful in life. So, yeah.
yeah, yeah, I can see that argument, and I mean, I think too, I was like, well, what could I ask that could be potentially useful? And I said to you before off air that like the things that I'm focusing on professionally at the moment, my writing, the podcast, and studying Japanese. So I suppose I could ask questions that are essentially along the lines of like, am I going to be successful? But I'd have to ask something more concrete than that, because success is, it's up for debate. So we could ask the question that you kind of came up with. It's like, will there be a book? Let's just start with, will there be a book where I'll get a 5-figure or more advance? Let's start lower than $1 million. But then, like, the answer to that could change what I do. So if I'm going down and it's like, right, you're only gonna ever get like a 4-figure and a low 4-figure deal, then I might think, you know, should I change course? Should I stop doing that? But then it's like, well, am I? It's never
But but
been
but
just
that's what
about
that's
the
what I mean by
money.
stealing the
So
joy, because
yeah,
surely the pursuit,
yeah,
like it's like when you watch a sports, like, all right, sportscasters, you watch a sports game, you watch a football game, like, if you know the score, why would you bother watching it? Like that old cliche where someone in a sitcom where someone's desperately trying to not find out the score and they find it in the final moment. Like, that's life, isn't it? Like, not knowing the score, not knowing whether you win or lose. Like, that's the point. To always hope you win and always prepare for if you don't. And if you know you're going to get the book deal you want, I just think that steals the joy of the win.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think as well, if I fixate on any question I ask, could miss out on another potential benefit because of the question I didn't ask. Like, will this book bring me joy in the writing of it? Now, maybe the answer is no, but maybe I didn't ask, will this book impact and change the course of someone else's life? And if the answer to that is yes,
Yeah.
so yeah,
But also bigger than that. I get that point entirely, and we're getting very deep into the weeds on this. Sorry, but it even beyond balancing that benefit against that benefit or asking the right question, the benefit is not knowing, because the benefit is the surprise. Because surprise is the thing that makes life worth living. What happened? What might happen today? So not having the answer is the reward, I think.
Mm-hmm.
yeah,
A life, because we said right at the start, you said, Bob, it's about this, the questions at the end are about a life well lived. He would have lived a better life had he not known.
Yes. It's also interesting too, because this whole conversation that we're having right now is tempered by the fact that we read the story. And so we are armed with forementioned information to kind of slant our questions in a certain way. If we had never read the story and we saw the answer man, and let's say I decided to pull over and he kind of gave me his little spiel and I gave him my money and he started this clock, then I would probably ask some of the same, general questions that anyone else would ask in that kind of situation. Being that we've already read the story, we're armed now with information. We can go in and ask questions, like questions that I would have concerning my family aren't if somebody's going to be healthy or things like that. It's more on the lines of, hey, well, so and so and so and so ever reconcile? Things like that. Things that I have seen in my life, that between people in my family that have hurt one another, and seeing that pain has also hurt me. And I feel like if they would reconcile, that would give me a little bit of joy in my life. Not that it's something that's so painful that it's keeping me from moving on, but those are the type of things that I would want to know. When it comes to the finality of life, we're all going to fucking die. I don't want to know when I'm going to die. To me, that would just put a race on me not being fulfilled in everything I want to do. If they say, "Hey, you got 6 months to live," then I would think, "Well, shit, can't do everything I want to do in 6 months." You know, um, I can pick 3, right? And so the first thing I do would be quit my job. But don't need work no more. Sorry, guys. See you later. But I don't. That's something I don't want to know.
And then it leads on to kind of one of the questions at the thrust of the story, which is, has the answer man seen or has he made the future? Because I mean, in all these examples, we can see how they become a self-fulfilling prophecy. So even Bob saying about the 2 members of his family or friends that they reconcile, well, if the answer is no, then you're probably never going to push them towards that because it's futile. But actually, if you didn't know that, then there might be more opportunities for them to reconcile. Similarly, if you're told you've only got 6 months to live, you quit your job, and now you've not got your health care. And if you'd had your health care, it could have helped prolong your life. So we got to be careful with this. And, has the answer man seen or made the future? We're not given a definitive answer to that. That is an answer that is not provided. You should
Yes.
have asked him that. That's what
Yeah.
I should ask, because you can ask that question and then it doesn't impact your future, at least. But just to know, just to have that knowledge.
Here's my final word on the answer, man. What I would ask. A question that literally could no, I was going to say a question that couldn't hurt me or steal my joy. I was going to say I would ask, is there a Bigfoot? Because it's the question I want the answer to. Is Bigfoot real? But then again, do I want to know really? Because where's the mystery? I want the mystery. So even that question I can't ask, safe from the theft of joy.
If you ask that, I imagine, if it's no, then the joy is gone. You're probably never going to read up on anything to do with Bigfoot again. That's it. It's over. But if the answer is yes, we ain't got talking scared no more. It's talking Bigfoot. I
Yeah, you're
can
right.
see you get obsessed. You become the man that discovers Bigfoot because you are the only person who definitively knows that Bigfoot exists, and now you're going to prove it.
Me and Joe R. Lansdale disappear into the woods to try and find Bigfoot. Yeah, what a podcast that I mean, sign that up for a Netflix documentary right now. Yeah.
Joe R. Lansdale is a very smart choice. That is a very worldly man. That is a man who invented his own martial arts. He's a survivor. So
and he told me he knows people who know things about Bigfoot. So I've always been intrigued. Yeah.
Oh yeah, I think Joe knows a lot of things and a lot of people that would
I imagine Joe knows who killed Kennedy, to be honest. Yeah.
And what a note to end the Answer Man discussion on. If people predicted or were trying to predict where will this conversation go, I don't think they imagined that was the note to to sum up the Answer Man. But it is. And so where we're going now is Bob's number 1 story pick, and actually mine and Neil's number 2. So what have we got, Bob?
Danny Coughlin's Bad Dream. And I particularly like the story. I love it when writers break quote unquote rules. Straub did it in The Throat, said don't open with the flashback. And in the first 100 pages of the book, about 85 of them are a flashback. So Steve opens up with a dream. And that's one of the little unspoken, quote unquote, you don't open with a dream. But is it really a dream? Steve gets his eyes from what ifs. Like, what if this happened? What if this happened? I think this is really special because this what if is something I haven't really seen before. What if I had one singular psychic experience? How would that affect me? And so that's pretty much what this story is about. To kind of give you the gist of it, Danny Coughlin's a janitor. He's working, during the summer, keeping the school clean, getting it ready to go, for school. And he has a terrible, terrible dream that he's propelled to travel down this road to behind a derelict gas station and see something horrific. He sees a mangy old dog chewing on a hand sticking up from the ground. Someone's been buried in the dirt, and this dog is gnawing at this woman's hand, gnawing at her fingers. And I think it's interesting too because I'm pretty sure Danny, though he probably doesn't actually realize it, but dreams are fleeting when you wake up. You might have a bad dream, and within a few minutes, you can't remember exactly all the details of the dream. So even though Danny woke up and he felt that he had a bad dream, I think he's slowly starting to realize that this wasn't a bad dream, that this is something that is lingering. He can't get it out of his head. There's no parts of the dream that are decaying or morphing or changing or anything like that. He doesn't use the word vision, which I think is really, really good, but that's apparently what Danny's had. Danny's had a singular psychic experience vision that is very not prophetic, but something from the recent past. He starts doing some Google searches like, hey, there's a sign. Maybe is that place even real? And so he discovers that yes, there is a real sign. He finds pictures of the actual location and decides to go there. He is compelled. He is. I can imagine if I had a vision in my head like this, I would Richard Dreyfuss myself all the way across the land to Devil's Tower and see what the hell was going on. And that's pretty much what Danny does, is that he is compelled. He must go and see if this is actually something that happened. And to his horror, it is. And so Danny does what he feels is the right thing to do. But he doesn't want any notoriety. He wants his whole urgency in this is the fact that there's a woman, someone is missing her. She's not, among the living anymore, and people need to know. And so he doesn't want any type of credit for it or anything like that. He wants to remain anonymous, but it's the right thing to do. He probably goes about it in a bad way because the Kansas Bureau of Investigations finds out who he is, narrows it down almost psychically, but it just, for the gist of the story, they use, CCTV and all that and closed caption TV and all that and get video footage of him, buying a burner phone. And then we get into the second part of the story where these two Kansas City, basically they're like the state FBI. These two cops, one who's been on the force for 5 years and she's good, she's smart. She's, as we find out, a little bit more compassionate. And then the star detective, Mr. And I guess Detective Jalbert, which is like a really, really severe nod to Javert from Les Miserables. So, it's like as soon as I seen his name, I was like, oh, that sounds familiar. This guy's going to be tenacious. And he also has a strange OCD affliction that becomes evident more and more and more as you go along. 7. But anyway, kind of give you an idea. This is a story of obsessions, and how we're compelled to see our obsessions to the end, and sometimes to the bitter end. And the writing in this reminded me a lot of The Outsider. It's just it had this
Yeah.
sense of urgency to it, and he lackadaisically kind of goes through the story. It's not like it's bam, 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 bam. There's a lot of stuff going on. There's a lot of internal thought. There's a lot of worry. There's a lot of pain involved as we get into the story. But I like that he's taken his time and given us this really compelling set of characters to kind of tell this tale. He couldn't do this in 30 pages. He couldn't do this in a 5,000 word story. This story deserved the heft of a novella. And I didn't feel that it was very long at all. I breezed through it. Reading it again, I'm taking my time and going, a lot more slower on it because there's so many details. But the first time I breezed through the story, I read it like in 2 nights, boom, boom, and I was like, "Holy shit! This is one of the best things that he's done in a long time." Which isn't true. He's done a lot of great things since then. But this story, I don't want to say it's old school Stephen King because it's really not. But it reminds me very much of that Mr. Mercedes, Holly, the Outsider era that I've grown to love. It's a detective story where our detective is the least likely detective in the world, and it really it hit me in all the right ways. So I know anything else, I'm just gushing on it now. So
It reminds me of a Bachman book.
yes. Yes, and at first I thought it said Batman. I was like, okay, that's weird, but you meant Bachman, yeah,
Yeah, Bachman, yeah. But a kinder sort of story than Bachman, but nonetheless, that it reminds me a little bit of something like The Outsider. Definitely is sort of with the impossible crime and stuff like that. Although it's not an impossible crime, it's an impossible solution. But regardless, that's definitely in there. But it reminds me as well. You mentioned the urgency, but the kind of lackadaisical urgency, and that really reminds me of Dolan's Cadillac from Nightmares and Dreamscapes, which is another story about obsession. And there's something about King writing about crime that I don't like the Holly books at all, but I don't like the Mr. Mercedes books particularly. But when King gets on a crime groove, on like a Jim M. Thompson type groove, I like it. Yeah, I think this is a great story.
Yeah, it's I like that he gives us an everyman for this, and someone who didn't want this bad dream. He compares and contrasts obsession. It's like you have somebody who's compelled to seek the truth, and you have someone else who is compelled to be right all the time, which is Jalbert. He's to me his obsession, and it falls in line with his obsession with his OCD with his number affliction and all that. His ritualistic behavior. This is the person who can't stand to be wrong about anything. It's apparent in his conversations with Davis. It's apparent with every single conversation. He is literally trying, under the guise of law and order and helping out poor Miss Yvonne, that he's literally trying to find a way to frame Danny so he can be right. And that's not even a spoiler. You can kind of consider that's the idea. He goes to great lengths to do this, all within legal boundaries. But he pushes them. And as we get deeper and deeper and deeper into his obsessions and things like that, it becomes apparent that this isn't going to end in a good way. Fortunately, sometimes lightning does strike twice. That's all I'll say. I don't want to spoil anything, but it sometimes when it does, and you have to be there to pay attention to it. So,
Yeah, and it's interesting too that Ella Davis, who is the good cop, as it were. She doesn't start off that way. In the opening scene, she's actually the bad cop. She's more convinced than Frank Gelbert that Danny did it. And I mean, it really is a comedy of errors in many ways. I mean, not a comedy for Danny, but just the way that he kind of phones this in, all of the mistakes that he makes. But, I mean, as Danny kind of says himself, I mean, he's made these mistakes because he didn't do it. He's not a criminal. I mean, apart from the burner phone, he's not really thinking, I have to protect my tracks, because there was no crime that he committed. And, even when he manages to lawyer up, I mean, I was laughing aloud and shaking my head because he gets a real estate lawyer.
I do love the lawyer. The lawyer is one of those great, sort of well-meaning scuzzball characters that King writes so well. He's one of the standout characters in this for me. Injects a
Yeah,
lovely degree of levity.
yeah, and I
Shows up
like
on his
that.
motorcycle with his
Yeah.
boots on and shorts. I'm like,
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah.
I love this man. I love him.
He kind of reminds me, we talked a lot about this. He's kind of like some Florida stories. And there's one story with a direct link to Duma Key. The lawyer, I can't remember his name, it reminds me of the character of Wise Man from Duma Key. That kind of laid back, southern baked, Hawaiian shirt wearing dude. I just really, really love him.
He was, who he reminds me of is Travis McGee from the the McDonald's stories.
Okay.
And I have to, he had all the colors and the names. But Travis McGee lived on a boat out in Florida, and he was a private eye.
Oh.
And he, and he always had some girl that he was, helping along. But that's what the attorney kind of reminded me of, just a little bit of, because just real laid back, but new as shit,
Yeah.
and that's it was it might be those books might be a little off your normal. They come out like in the 60s and the 70s. So, but I know that Stephen King was definitely influenced by him.
Yeah, and I appreciated the nod towards possibly one of the most beloved and crooked lawyers of recent times on television, Saul Goodman.
Saul Goodman,
We just
yeah.
got a line, but saying
Yeah.
it was no Perry Mason or Saul Goodman, but I did appreciate that Easter egg that King threw in there. And I mean, King is not afraid to make, contemporary references. He's done it throughout his career. And, some people kind of caution against that for fear of dating the book. But it's like, well, no, I like it being a product of its time. It adds an authenticity and a credibility to it. So, I mean, people are divided on that one, but I personally like to throw in references like that. I don't know where both of you stand.
I always get a bit taken aback when he throws modern references in. I think I've said this to somebody else recently. I can't remember who. I think it was on one of my short story chats that I did recently on the podcast. But I find it weird when King does modern references, because to me, King is always a writer who should be writing about the 70s and 80s, because I want him to be writing the books that I read when I was a teenager. Do you know what I mean? So when he writes about iPhones, I'm always like, that feels anachronistic to me. But of course, he was always doing contemporary reference. It's just that the contemporary reference in the books I read as a kid were more, felt like period details, whereas now they don't.
I feel that every story ever written is dated. It's dated as soon as you start to write it. Unless you're deliberately doing a story that has to deal with time, uh, or something that's out of time or something like that. I think that every story is dated. And so I don't have a problem using any type of, brand references, things like that. To me, it's a lot easier than to sit there and try to think of a brand name for something that might be important to a character that also fits with them thematically. To me, that's just like that. That's part of writing that I don't really like it unless it comes to me immediately. It's like, oh, well, shoot, I should call it that, you know. But if it's something I've got to sit there and spend time with and break out a pen and paper and write down a bunch of names, I could be writing. So it's like, sometimes a pack of Marlboro cigarettes is great. You know, that's what that's what most people smoke if they're going to smoke. Occasionally you got that that character who smokes a pack of Cools, but just kind of using that for an example. Um, I think that every story is dated. I don't think it really matters unless I'm doing something like It Follows, where we can't tell what time period we're in, which makes it all the more creepier.
Yeah,
That
yeah,
has to be on a visual, auditory type scale, whereas on the written page, that would be really hard to pull off. I think, but that's me.
See, anytime we bring up It Follows, I immediately want to rewatch it. That is a spectacular film that I didn't think that the first time I watched it, but the more times I've rewatched it, I've come to appreciate it. And the soundtrack is remarkable too.
mm,
Mm-hmm.
But we should hold that thought until we unbox It Follows. Otherwise, we're going to go off on another massive tangent there. But I mean, one thing that you said earlier was, of course, about Frank Gelbert's obsession. And I mean, this is where when evidence or things start to come in that may let Danny off the hook, this is when Ella Davis starts to soften. She's very rational in her approach and just trying to not let other things cloud her judgment. Just look at the facts, just look at what we're dealing with. And of course, there's a moment early on where Danny seems to have some sort of relief that there's a potential DNA test that would let him off the hook. And Frank Gelber, I think he was doing that as a bluff, but Ella's like, no, he looked visibly relieved. So that's the turning point. But, Gelber, when evidence comes in, he doubles down. He starts like coming up with these theories as to how he could have got away with it. And, there's an encounter with one of the local cops. So one of the interviews happens at a local police station, and then the local cop, he says, like, I think it's to Danny, just like, I want you to know, we all know about Frank Gelbert, and he
mm.
don't quit, once he's decided something.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I mean, it goes from this comedy of errors, as I put it before, and we didn't mention as well that, like, I mean, another part of that is there was an incident where there were charges against Danny, a while back with his ex-wife. So it doesn't look good that there's already a record of some untoward behavior. But yeah, like Gilbert, he just obsesses, and I mean, we're getting into even more spoiler territory now, but he will, if there are some things that don't quite fit, he'll try to create the evidence to fit his own
Mm-hmm.
narrative.
That's a
And
chilling scene, that, with the
yeah,
dodgy copper. That is, I think, because
Mm-hmm.
King writes really well about the sort of claustrophobia of corruption when you're just an everyman and you're stuck in this corrupt machine, and I think that's a great example of it. You really feel the fear for Danny. There's two parts: when he loses his job and that, and you think, oh God, this would be a truly nightmarish scenario.
Yeah. It
yeah,
begins as a comedy of errors, but it slowly turns into a paranoid Kafka esque,
Mm,
situation that any one of us could ever find ourselves in. I think that's a fear that we all have, is that we tried to do the right thing and then the blame gets put on us. and that's something that I think that's primal. We all fear that, and he taps into this so well. I felt bad for Danny because we know the truth, but I also know the King, and for some reason when I first read this story, I had this inkling that there was going to be a part where Danny was going to go, but and kind of like an internal dialogue, and it's like, well, they're not going to find that out, but I did kill her, and so it'd be like, oh, what the fuck, but he didn't go that route, and so, but I was initially thinking, okay, this is where it's going to go, but it didn't go that route. I'm glad he didn't, because that would have been a little cliche. I can't think of any other story like that, and I'm sure he could have rocked it, but there was that that little initial thought, and I was like, but he turns it into something even more horrifying, and what starts off as something almost laughable turns into a very, very paranoid, claustrophobic experience, and I love that. That's to be able to experience that with having a safety net. It's a story that's as close to thrilling as you can get. But if it was in real life, oh my god.
There are parts of the story where you do actually take a second and go, "Oh God, if this actually happened, what the hell would I do?"
Right.
Because how would you ever convince anybody of this? You might convince your family, but you wouldn't convince me. And it's quite a breezy story. Like there's not much sense of like mortal peril for Danny for a lot of the story. It's this slowly boiling, the whole thing about you boil a frog, that incrementalism and stuff. And it's like this slowly simmering thing where it gets worse and worse. And all of a sudden you go, oh God, this is pretty fucking dire situation, but it's quite a leisurely way of getting there, which I think actually heightens it overall, because for so much of it, you, like Danny, think, well, he's kind of like, well, I'm innocent, so I can't go to prison because I haven't done it. And then slowly you realize that the apparatus of state and the apparatus of one man's obsession means that your innocence is an irrelevance if you can't prove you're innocent, even though you shouldn't have to.
Yeah. Oh, I agree 100%. And I think that's why he took his time with this story, because we really have to know Danny for it to work. And he gets us into characters so quickly. And it's like, I feel like I've gotten better at it, but I remember my first attempts at writing when I was younger, as how I'd spend about a page describing what a character, who this person was. And I remember still doing that in like my first, in-person critique groups. And I had somebody who was actually published, she looked at my work and she said, you got really, really good character descriptions. It's really, really good, but I don't need it at the beginning of your story.
Yeah.
Because you need to pepper this throughout. You need to truncate it, cut it down, get to the good stuff, but give me them juicy bits as we go along. Let's get into the story. And that was some of the best constructive criticism I ever had, because I used to write like a whole page. It's like, well, Danny Coughlin was tall, and and he was a janitor, and he did all this, and then one day Danny had a terrible dream. And it's like page 3. So that's kind of giving that. He gets into so quick. That's a masterclass in getting into characters very quickly. He does it exceptionally well.
And so before we move on to the next story, I mean, my indulgent question, as I'll do with a lot of these, is what would you do if you had the dream? And let's say it is a vivid dream, as is presented in the story. It's hyper realistic. There just seems, even though you don't have beliefs in the supernatural, there's just something about this dream that seems real. You can't get it out of your head. So are you going to the scene? Are you bringing other people with you? I think if you do go to the scene, my my opinion is you need to bring other people. Maybe, with today's technology, video document you leaving to go to the scene to begin with. And then if you do get there and you find this body, are you calling it in? Are you calling it in as yourself? Are you doing it anonymously? What the hell is going on in this?
I'm going nowhere near any of it.
Yeah,
I'm just staying at home. Like, it's a dream. I'm not getting involved.
I think
Yeah.
that honestly, that if I had a dream like that, that I would probably end up wanting to go talk to a therapist before I did anything. Because that would be so out of nature of anything I'd ever experienced. I would begin to, and obviously, hey, if I think I'm crazy, therefore I cannot be. Um, I would think that there could be something not right with my mind, and that would scare me really really bad, like a form of dementia or something like that, an intrusive thought. Maybe I went there and I forgot. That would be the most horrifying thing to me, especially I'm 57. Um, it's I'm not too young to have any type of cognitive issues. So if something like that happened to me at this point in time, I would probably want to at least have a medical opinion of it, because that's me personally. That's I've seen what people go through, dealing with people who have had cognitive issues and things like that, and I would hate to be anyone's burden, if that was happening to me. Um, and so I would definitely, I wouldn't like go check myself into a hospital, but I would definitely be like, hey, this happened to me. I don't feel like this is a dream. I'm thinking I might have actually went to this place and forgot about this, and I need to know what's going on. Um, that's probably what I would do. I don't think I would venture out there on my own and try to find this vivid image in my head. I'd be too scared of it.
I mean, just so you know, I once had a dream that I was in a plane crash the night before I had to get on a flight, and I got on the flight. So I'm quite capable of just putting my dreams in my pocket and moving on with my life. You know what I mean? So if I'm dreaming of somebody out behind a Texaco station in a shallow grave, that's just a dream. I'm going nowhere near that Texaco station.
Yeah. I guess what I'm saying is that if I had a dream, a vision of this intensity, I can barely remember most of my dreams. I remember little details, that I woke up and in my dream I was sleeping and I woke up and I had a piece of metal in my arm, but it wasn't like bloody or anything like that. It was just a piece of metal that was in my arm. I had that dream. What did it mean? I don't know. That's what woke me up. Is I've got this won't come out. I woke up. And then but there was other parts of the dream too. They're gone. You know, if something like what Danny had, that is like a movie that's playing in your head, that it play and you see it fresh every single time. That's like an intrusive thought to me. That would drive me in. That would drive me insane. It would make me crazy. So that would be so unnatural from what I've experienced in my own life, that it would make me question the validity of my thoughts and things like that,
I get that, yeah.
because that was so out of character. If it was that vivid, that intense, something like that, I'd be like, man, this is something. This is a memory. But I probably would not have gone the route, because truth be known, I'd be scared to death of what I'd find.
Hmm.
Yeah, I think we often have kind of anxiety dreams or dreams that are based on our worries and things coming up. So if I have a kind of airplane crash dream a day before I'm getting on a flight, it's just me worrying about it. When there'd been an absence from me driving for quite some time, and I knew, right, I'm going to start driving again, I started having these weird dreams where, like, I'm in the car driving and then the car just takes control of itself. And, well, this has turned into a Stephen King book already, a quite famous one. It's just like mowing people down. It's not like a Tesla. This is a evil car, and I'm in control. And yeah, I still got in the car, trusting that would not happen. And so far, months down the road, it hasn't. So hopefully, I'm safe at this point, and I'm not having those dreams anymore. I suppose the only exception in terms of how it might, I don't know, change my actions a bit is, so if I have the airplane dream, but we actually have, it's quite a long dream, and we're in the airport beforehand, and there are specific details like, oh,
Yeah,
I see
like in
the,
Final Destination.
right, yeah. So if that happens now, yeah, as you said, it's like I'm literally just describing Final Destination. Yeah, now I'm not getting on the plane, but I, in normal terms, I don't have enough money to be able to throw away a plane ticket, so I'm getting on the plane. That's where I'm going. And on that note, we should move to the next story, I think, which is the third one in my top three. And it is the shortest story in the collection. It is The Fifth Step. Now, I think this is the best of his short stories within this book. We've said it's split into short stories and novellas, and it very much reminded me of the Night Shift era of Stephen King's stories.
Yeah.
I think it would have slotted in really well there. I think, I'm looking at the Night Shift stories now. There's so many, like even Quitters Inc. and I Know What You Need and The Man Who Loved
It reminds me
Flowers.
quite specifically of The Man Who Loves Flowers. I think it's a similar twist.
Yeah, and so this is one where we can't actually say that much about it without giving the whole game away, but it is called The Fifth Step. There's the protagonist, Harold Jameson. I don't think it's a coincidence that, his name is almost Jameson, Irish
Yeah,
whiskey.
yeah.
And he's approached by, someone called Jack, again, the most kind of benign everyman name you could have. And, he's on the AA program, the 12-step program, and step 5 is to admit to God and ourselves and to another human being the exact nature of our wrongs. And his sponsor has told him that unfortunately he can't admit to him. He has to find, a complete stranger, and Jameson is the person that he talks to. And he starts, just telling him about his life. I mean, the first mistake that Jameson makes is allowing this random guy to talk to him. It's like, move on. Don't, get on with your life. And it does start off innocently enough, but then slowly the things that he's saying are ratcheting up. I mean, at the point where he is describing having these fantasies about hurting his own wife, that is the point, or beyond the point, where you should be like, mate, this isn't what I signed up for. I'm off. But yeah, it gets progressively and quickly, it gets out of control, because this is by far the shortest story in the book. So yeah, we've gone from discussing the longest to the shortest. And, you know, obviously the type of tale this is, it's not it's not like, the most layered and philosophical. We've gone from discussing something that we can look at on numerous levels, Danny Coughlin's Bad Dream, to something that is a little bit more face value, but it's just fun. It's just nostalgic Stephen King with a little bit of a twist, a little bit of a trick. And whilst I love it because I like those types of stories, I can see how it's going to divide people who they're not as into the Trick King story. But I think he likes them too, because there's a few of them in this collection, and it's just a fun read. So yeah, those are my opening comments.
Yeah, I thought it was definitely a throwback to Night Shift, no doubt. And it's like in all of his collections, and Night Shift, being the seminal one. My favorite is Skeleton Crew, but the in those stories in Night Shift are, I mean, it's beyond nostalgia. It's like they're timeless. They've got some of his best work, and it's amazing to see that it's his earliest attempts at writing short stories. A lot of these were published in men's magazines like Cavalier and Gallery. You know, those pulpy, nudie magazines that had I guess pages with fiction in them, and so there's that kind of pulpy feel to this story that's very nostalgic to me. Um, I do like tricky stories like this. I don't like a lot of them, but I feel that King kind of when he does them like no one else, and it's like you can tell a King, like story that has a twist to it compared to other writers that will do something similar. His twist have multiple meanings, and sometimes, like in this one, I think they were just kind of on the nose, and it's like there ain't no other meaning to it. This is it. So I can't really talk about it. It's one of those words you can't fucking talk about.
Yes, because one thing that occurred to me, Bob. Well, it didn't occur to me. It was actually said to me. I did. I talked about some of these stories with Stephen Graham Jones on the Kingcast, and Stephen said to me something that had not dawned on me. I'm going to phrase this in a way that doesn't spoil things. This guy is sitting on the bench talking about the fifth step and like the AA program. So we're led to believe he's got an addiction, but you could read it as the thing he does at the end is his version of fighting his alcoholism, or you could read it as the thing he does at the end is what he's actually addicted to.
Yeah, and he kind of admits, having a propensity towards the thing he does at the end. I think us just talking about the thing he does at the end is going to immediately, anyone who's not read it, they're like, right, I'm reading this now. You managed to articulate that tremendously well without giving a spoiler away. But I think as well, like, what's shocking is how, and Bob alluded to this, how unflinching the conclusion is. And goodness, yeah, this is hard to, because some of the words that I want to use to describe it will then give away the thing he does at the end. And I love that interpretation from Stephen Graham Jones as well, that it's like, what is he addicted to here? And now that's making me think as well, like, is the alcoholism a complete facade? How much of this is true? Who is the sponsor? Is the sponsor somehow not complicit? But what's going on here? I don't even know. Is the sponsor real? Is the sponsor part of his imagination. So I opened saying this is a simple story that doesn't have as many layers, but in the course of 2 minutes, you've just opened up so many layers here
It
and so
deserves
many
a reread.
interpretations. Oh, yeah.
Well, I need to reread it because there are two stories in this. Well, naturally, three stories in this collection that I had a really negative reaction to, and this is one of them. And I think it's the one that is unfair to have that reaction to. The other two, by the way, are Red Screen and Finn. And boy, have I changed my opinion on Finn, which I at first was bewildered by, and now I'm like, I love its madcap glory. But the fifth step, the reason I reacted badly to this one, I kind of bounced off it, is because it comes after Two Talented Bastids, which is such an immersive, warm, again, it's like a homecoming Stephen King story. I remember reading it thinking like, oh, this feels like reading King from the late 70s to mid 80s when he was writing the books that, you know, kind of made his name. It felt like reading one of those stories. And I thought, oh, great, are we going to get a whole 600-page collection of that syrupy caramel tone story? And then straight off the back of that, from the 100 pages of that lovely story, we then get the nasty, sharp razor blade of the fifth step. And I think I wasn't prepared for it. So I didn't like it. But I think I need to go back and read it again. I do, however, think that it's something he's done before in other stories. I think he's done it more poetically in other stories. And I also kind of feel like, and I'm sure if he heard this, he would be like, who the fuck are you, Neil? I feel like he doesn't need to write this kind of story anymore. I don't know who he's writing this kind of story for. I'm glad that you loved it, you know what I mean? But when he sits down to write it, his answer would be he's writing it for himself, right? But he's kind of already written it before. So I don't know what the purpose of this story is other than just to kind of scratch whatever itch he had. Whereas other things in this book are genuinely new and genuinely kind of wow, you know. So yeah, just didn't love it as much as so many other tales.
So let's then talk about our kind of quick reactions and thoughts on the other stories that unfortunately time is preventing us from going into too much depth on. And
Yeah.
I
Sorry,
think
listeners, I've got to be on a flight in 5 hours. It's my fault.
that's entirely reasonable, and I didn't realize that the time you have to be on a flight in
No.
5.
I've got to get up in 5 hours and go to the airport. It's all good. It's all fine.
Okay.
Don't panic.
I
don't
don't
need
know
much
if it
sleep.
is all good. That's not a lot of sleep, but we appreciate this, and I'm sure our listeners and your listeners do as well. But the next story is Willie the Weirdo, which actually is my least favorite story. So it's interesting that, back to back, we've had one that you didn't respond to as much, and then one that I didn't respond to as much. And I should say, in terms of the placing, I mean, you said you'd have appreciated the fifth step more, perhaps had it been placed somewhere else. I can only assume that the decision that Steve or the publisher made was because Two Talented Bastards is one of the longer pieces, and then I believe Danny Coughlin's Bad Dream is
Yeah.
the longest piece in the entire collection, that they just wanted to have a couple of shorter stories. And also, like, I felt that almost this whole collection was celebrating the range and the tones that Steve can provide in his writing. So in a way, calling You Like It Darker is a little bit deceptive, because we do get it a lot darker, but then we get these other kind of nuances, and it's really a reflection of his outstanding career thus far. But yeah, with Willie the Weirdo, I didn't enjoy it so much to begin with, but I've I have reread it, and I felt that in the rereading I appreciated it a little bit more, but it just was lacking a little bit for me. But I mean, as I believe you enjoyed it more, why don't we start with some of your thoughts?
I just like it because I like when King writes about friendships between young boys and old men, because so often he manages to do it without making it creepy. But now and again, as in this and say apt pupil, he goes full creepy. And I just really like that dynamic because I kind of like Grandpa James in this story as well, because I've had many sort of sinister old relatives in my life. And when you're a little boy, they're all wonderful. Grandpa James, it turns out, not that wonderful, but I just like the dynamic of it. I like the nasty little twist at the end as well because it's properly nasty. I like when kid does awful things to kids because it's like he's really going for it, you know.
Yeah, yeah, that's an interesting comment. It's like, you're fine with violence towards children, but don't harm an animal,
Completely,
specifically a
yeah,
dog. I believe
completely, yeah,
is
completely,
your
yeah,
take based on
yeah,
previous conversations and
yeah, exactly,
comments.
yeah,
And yeah, I mean, this is about an outcast, Willie the Weirdo. The clue is in the name, but he has a strong relationship and almost idolization of his grandfather, and there's there's a twist at the end of this one as well, but I guess it's a little bit more layered in the way in which it's provided.
mm-hmm.
Bob, what did you think to this one?
It was, to me, I felt that it was King riffing on Ramsey Campbell. And in other words, like not trying to write like a Ramsey Campbell story, but writing about some of the things that early Ramsey Campbell wrote about, especially like in influence and things like that, where you and I'm not trying to spoil the story or anything like that, but it's King's version of this Campbell concept of possession, reincarnation, something like that. But it's King's version of it, and it doesn't hit the same as Campbell's because of the twist, which is, you know, it's a good story. It's not my favorite. It's not one that I really don't. I don't know. It's just, I hate to say it, but I mean, it really didn't appeal to me.
Yeah, yeah. And the next story is Finn, which again is kind of in my bottom half of stories. It's about an Irish guy who is kidnapped in a supposed case of mistaken identity. And I mean, a lot of the story does revolve around, yeah, his kidnapping and being taken hostage and questioned. And I fe- I don't know. I felt that I wanted a little bit more from this one. And again, it's very short, so there's not too much that can be said without really jumping.
I like this a lot. I didn't like it at all at first. I was bewildered by it. I was like, what is this story? I don't what? And then when I've read it again, I like it because of that. Because it feels like one of a small selection of stories in this where King is actually trying something new. A lot of these stories retread old ground. This one, with some exception, there's reminiscences to In the Death Room from Everything's Eventual, but on the whole, it feels like an entirely new endeavor. And some of it clashes against the ear maybe, but I like quite how strange it is, because King doesn't do this kind of strange very often.
Yeah, I would agree that it's. I don't know. It's definitely different from what he's done before. And I like it when a writer says, "Hey, I want to try something that I've never done before. That I haven't seen him do anything like this before." Um, but at the end of the day, again, it was not. It kind of pales in comparisons to some of the other stories. And if their other stories weren't in there, if this was just a collection of his short stories and not any of the novellas, then it would have felt very lopsided. And which I mean, there would have been just a couple of really, really good stories, but then there were some stories that were kind of middling. That didn't appeal to me. I mean, other people may really like them. Neil, you liked the story, and so, but I do like that he went on a limb and he tried something different, and that's always good to see. Good, it's refreshing.
But you are right. I mean, we're going to go through these, and they all pale in comparison to the longer stories, I think. No detriment to the stories themselves. Just the longer stories are so good that it's hard for these shorter, funnier, more sort of twisty little stories to keep up, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, although interestingly, On Slide-In Road, which is a short story but a longer short story, does in fact round out your top 3, Neil. So
yeah, it's this or The Dreamers, and I think this edges it just because I love the old man in it, because he reminds me of my dad. My dad's a nicer person than this old man. It's basically a story about a family, a bickering family, of different, multi-generational family, kids, parents, and this irascible old grandfather who run into trouble on an isolated rural main road. I think it's on the way to Derry. And what I like is that the very characters about the grandfather that culture asks us to condemn so often, in this one instance, are very useful and necessary. And I like that in this short dose. I wouldn't want a whole book about that character, because it'd be played by Clint Eastwood and it'd be awful, because we've seen that, geriatric action movie stuff. I don't need it. It smacks of boomer republicanism to me. But in a short dose like this, I think it's just delightful and funny, and it makes you want to kind of cheer for this old dude.
Mm-hmm. So often we see these heroes and stories, and they're always these young, the classic example. And so what makes this story special is like what Neil's saying is that we have an elderly person who is got some grit, and can take care of business and knows what needs to be done, and has basically had enough. And again, repeating what Neil said, we've seen entire films of this shit, and it after you've seen one, you've seen the other. So in short bursts like this, it's excellent. We need to have more people who, as far as age is concerned, there's some older people in this world that are 70, 80, 90 years old that are still as strong as we are, who have taken care of themselves, and they've beaten the odds. And shoot, I'd love to see someone with the right mindset, and they could probably carry a whole story like that.
My old man is 88, and if he was in this situation, he would beat the fuck out of those two people.
Yeah,
And it's not a thing to celebrate, but now and again, it's just in a short story, it's quite fun.
yeah. My dad, when it came to things like that, he was. I know he could take care of it. I know he's no longer with us now because disease, disease will get you every time. But I never, in the one time that I've seen him actually confront someone, he never lifted a finger. His voice barely was above a whisper. But the person he was talking to, who was larger than him, their skin went white. And to this day, I do not know what he said, but it was very short and very succinct. And he stood up to this man and said something, and the guy paled and turned around and walked off.
And this
And I'm
story
like,
is a
that's some fucking power right there.
Yeah, and this story is a little chance to celebrate that thing that quite rightly we're not supposed to celebrate anymore. I get it. We're all, post-millennial, civilized human beings who understand that violence is not the answer. But in a short burst, it's nice to celebrate that old school masculinity, and then move on to a different story. But just in that little capsule, I like it. That's why I like the story. It's satisfying, right? It's satisfying. The good guy wins.
Yeah, and this is a throwback in so many ways, not just in terms of the values and the character of the grandpop, but it reminds me of the older crime stories that King did, but they're not just King, but some of the greats like Raymond Carver. And of course, Flannery O'Connor, and a very specific story, which I won't mention for people who haven't read this one yet. And indeed, he did dedicate the story to Flannery O'Connor at the end of this. So, yeah. I mean, that this just brings together so many delightful things. And yeah, I mean, with old school masculinity, I'm not saying it's a great thing, but it can be cathartic sometimes to read about,
Yeah.
It's not cathartic for me to go around doing this kind of thing, but in a kind of safe context and in kind of appropriate hands, such as King here and, Chuck's Fight Club, where there's obviously like a much wider message, then it can be enjoyable. There's something that just taps into that primitive side of the brain.
Exactly. The caveman brain, isn't it? Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Well, the next one is Red Screen, which I believe you said earlier was one of your, lower ranked stories.
It's my lowest story. I have nothing really to say about this one. It feels, I don't have any opinions about this story. It left me unmoved and largely disinterested. It's just not for me. It felt like a fragment of a much larger thing, maybe, but yeah, it's not for me.
Yeah, this one was kind of in the middle of the short stories for me, and but kind of for similar reasons. Just I came up with a different conclusion. Like, I did feel that I wanted to see this in a wider context. It felt like an appetizer. It was giving me the start of an idea of a premise, but I wanted to see, what does this look like if we expand it into a novelette? And
or it's the prequel to an epic novel of alien invasion, but it feels, it's not the prequel, it's like the prologue, but it feels like that. It feels like one chapter from something else.
Yeah, and I mean, so the titular red screen is something that this guy has seen, and then he's believed that over time his wife has become an alien. She's not the person who he believes her to be. So he's gone to the police station and he's confessed to Frank Wilson, a homicide detective, about what's happened here. And he's claiming, look, he didn't kill his wife because the person who looked like his wife was not his wife anymore, and that's essentially, yeah, what this is about. This is again quite a short one, and to begin with, Frank Wilson is thinking, he's so full of shit, and what an absolutely crazy idea. But then he starts thinking about it a little bit more, and it's hard to say without just completely telling the story as to what happens from there. But yeah, I think the red screen is a great idea, but I want this, as I say, in a novelette or a novella, or even possibly in a novel. But yeah, I ranked it fairly high for the short stories because I liked the idea, and so that was enough to pique my interest. But I suppose if we were to be analytical and to ask how did it work as just a story, then it's a little bit lacking. But I did have a good time with what I experienced. How about you, Bob?
Um, I felt like Neil. It felt like a fragment, a sketch, um, almost like it was something that felt. And Neil kind of, you actually kind of, succinctly put it into. It felt like a prologue, um, to something bigger. That would have been really cool, and then the idea was good. But as far as a story, it just felt incomplete. There was something about it that felt there just rather, if there's a twist, the ending just felt kind of like pluh, like there it is. So yeah, I kind of rank it, at the lower end. um which is, when I say that, I mean, here's the thing: this story was published, and it's in a collection. And so when I rank things at the lower end, it's still better than anything I'd write. I mean, it's still a Stephen King story, and I think my opinion would probably lead some people to maybe even, read it and cherish it as one of their favorites. So, I'm not, when I say that I didn't, like it, it doesn't mean it's bad. It just means I didn't like it, and this one just felt incomplete.
Yeah. Yeah, and it occurs to me, even though we're now going through the rest of the stories chronologically, somehow, because I did the fifth step and then we jumped in, we didn't actually cover Two Talented Bastards, which is one of my honorable mentions, and it's one of Bob's favorite stories too. So, I mean, did you want to kick off briefly with some thoughts on that one, Bob?
That just felt like old school, warm Stephen King. Um, just the whole presentation of it. I'm glad it was the first story in the bunch. It really kind of set the pace. When I started reading that story, I got goose pumps. I was like goose flesh. I was just like, man, this is why I picked up this collection, is to read these kind of stories.
Agreed.
It had a very, and I hate using, what's that?
No, I said yes. I agree. I just agree. It's
Yeah.
like a homecoming. Yeah.
It felt, and I hate using this kind of terminology, but it felt very Spielberg, and but in a good way. It had that. It felt Close Encounters. You know what I mean? It's so hard. It's like when you watch a film like that and you read a story like that, that you're getting into the good shit, and it's like this is why I read Stephen King. And so to start off with that, if you want to look at this like you were talking about how it's an album, this is Judas Priest's Painkiller. You start with a bang. Now, as I've gone along, there's stories that I like more, that meant more to me. Um, and it's like, Nightcrawler to me is actually a better song than Painkiller is now. because I've grown to like the album. But I'm using a terrible analogy, I know, but it works for me. So, but yeah, I love the story. I thought it was great. Not my absolute favorite. That would be Danny Coughlin, but golly, I mean that's it was great.
Yeah, and as I said at the start, it certainly seemed the most autobiographical. I mean, it centers around a famous writer who, it's told mostly through the eyes of his son, but the story is about the father who was a best-selling author, and just some of the reflections and some of the details, it almost feels like King is kind of confessing to us or telling us about his feelings as to, his own career. But the central premise, I mean, it is about these two talented bastards. So we've got the author Laird, and then we've got his childhood friend Butch. And when they were in their mid 40s, seemingly apropos of nothing, they both attained enormous success as a writer for Laird and as an artist for Butch. And this story is about unraveling that mystery. And it kind of starts with an interview, and then after Laird's death, or not after his death, but before his death, Laird tells his son, if you want to find the the key to what really happened, then you got to look in the locked bottom drawer of my desk. And after Laird's funeral, that's exactly where he goes, and the story opens up from there. And yeah, there's definitely, I can see the Spielberg reference you're making there, Bob. I didn't think of it at the time, but now you've said it, it completely makes sense. And this one as well, like it is like, drinking a warm mug of cocoa. It's like welcome home. You feel instantly at
Yeah.
ease. And for, long-term fans of Stephen King, there's all sorts of kind of either implicit or explicit references to other stories. Like we've got Mike Noonan and Bag of Bones. There's certainly something about the woods that brings to mind Dreamcatcher. And I mean, what we haven't said is there's a lot of that throughout, this whole collection. I mean, Rattlesnakes is effectively a sequel to Cujo, for example. And so, yeah, this is a great story. It really was a toss up between whether to have the fifth step or two talented bastards round out my top three. And I probably only went for the fifth step because it was the best of the short stories for me, but it could have been either one of them. So, yeah, fantastic stuff. And I'm aware that, the time that we're meant to have together today has really elapsed, and we need we need Neil to be able to get his flight safely. We don't want his dream that he had maybe years ago now to it's like, oh, it's manifesting
It's
on
coming true
this flight.
now.
So I mean, we haven't mentioned the Turbulence expert or Laurie or Rattlesnakes or the Dreamers, but if you have any strong comments either of you want to make on those, I mean, funnily enough, the Dreamers and Rattlesnakes, they're number 2 and 3 for Bob in terms of his top 3.
And I mean, I'll jump in there as a way to sum up, because to be honest, I don't have much to say about the Turbulence expert particularly. Laurie is a lovely story about a dog. I love dogs very much. It's a diversion. It's delightful. And there's a whole thing at the end of that where they add in a different kind of animal that I didn't think was necessary, because I would have happily just read about that old man and that dog. Rattlesnakes, I need to read again, because Rattlesnakes has not had the impact on me that it's had on a lot of people. I think it's a fine story. I think it's great, but it hasn't like wowed me in the way it's wowed so many people. And I think, I don't actually know why. I can't give you a reason for why. All I can say is when I read Bag of Bones the first time, and when I read Doomakey the first time, two books about a not dissimilar kind of haunting, They both left me completely cold. When I read them again, I think they're some of King's finest work. So I think I'll have a similar revisionist take on Rattlesnakes when I read it again. But there is one, I won't give anything away about the plot, but there is one moment in Rattlesnakes where you see, how to put this, you see ghosts where their heads are significantly younger than their bodies, and it is such a creepy image, perhaps the creepiest image across this entire collection. And the Dreamers is just brilliant. I mean, if you like Revival, you'll love the Dreamers, because it's that King doing cosmic weirdness, the implication that there are dark things beyond this human veil. And I love the fact that it's got this weird, it's set in the post-Vietnam era, but it's got this kind of gentleman scientist who feels like he's been ripped from the 1890s. So like you were saying before, Michael, about, or maybe you, Bob, about It Follows and the weird timelessness of that film. The Dreamers feels kind of similar. They tell us what time it is, but there's so many weird ingredients that feel like they're from different literary histories that it feels kind of unmoored in time in a way that I really enjoyed. The Dreamers was very close to being my pick for third.
Yeah, I really like the Dreamers, and you're right. It is set in a particular time. There's a timelessness about it, and I think that is because of our narrator's cadence, the way that he speaks. The gentleman scientist, things like that. But this story is basically any type of story deals with any type of forbidden knowledge. I'm all over it. That is my, that's the kind of stuff that I really, really like. And there's enough of that in this that really piqued my interest. I had no idea what it was going to be about. I didn't read any reviews before I read this book or anything like that, because I wanted to go into each story as fresh as I possibly could. And then when I started to realize what it was about, I was like, oh man, this is my jam right here. Rattlesnakes is an awesome story. I felt that the Cujo felt a little shoehorned. I don't think we needed any of the Cujo references. I think that this story could have worked on its own without having those references. We could still have the same character, things like that. Different names. I think that this story would have worked without it. I think that throwing in the Cujo references adds that little nostalgia flavor. That for me, that didn't hit. I really didn't think that the story needed it. I thought it was powerful enough on its own. Which, I mean, to me, that's it's a compliment. It's not probably the compliment you want to hear, but it was strong enough for me without all that.
I actually asked King about that, about whether Vic Trenton was always the protagonist, and he said no, because I got the inkling that he wasn't. That he was writing a story, and then he was saying that he needed this widower, and the thought came to him, but I don't think it was ever embarked upon. Well, I know it wasn't. He told me it wasn't embarked upon as a sequel to Cujo. It kind of got retrospectively converted into one when King cast around for a character that fit the bill.
Right, yeah.
I agree with you. I mean, there's some baggage there, right, with to do with, it's about ghosts of little boys, and Vic's lost his own little boy, but it doesn't need to be Vic. It doesn't need to be that family.
Right. It didn't need to be there. And I know a lot of people love that, and that's great. And I will say this: I will reread it again sometime in the future to see how I feel about that. But I'm not saying that it didn't need that as a way to detriment the story.
Yeah.
I think the story is powerful enough without it.
Yeah, I get what you mean. I agree. That's the story I'm most looking forward to rereading, because I think it's the one that's going to leap from like a 7 out of 10 up to like a 9.5 out of 10, based upon the fact that other stories like this have gone way up in my estimations over time. I think I'm going to love this when I read it next time, without the pressure of it being the big hype story in the collection, because everyone was waiting to get to Rattlesnakes. And I think it wasn't what anyone expected. And it's serious. I mean, what we haven't remarked on, it's seriously nasty. I mean, I said a bit ago about, I like when King does awful things to kids. I don't like it in this story. It's heartbreaking what happens to these little boys. It's like, it's awful.
Right.
In a way that, like, true horror, in the way that Gage Creed's Death in Pet Cemetery is awful. It goes past anything you can joke about, and it just becomes like soul scouring. But that, I mean, it's a horror podcast. This is horror, right? So we're here to celebrate this kind of shit.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, and I mean, Dreamers and then Rattlesnakes, they were the two weaker of the novellas for me, but
Interesting.
I think that is because of the absolute quality of like all of the novellas as a whole. And I'd agree with you. It's funny that we're both saying Rattlesnakes at the moment is probably the weakest for us, but it's a 7 out of 10, and it's like, what an endorsement. A 7 out of that is a good score, but it's only because he's put out these absolute bangers, to use modern parlance, with the top three. So I'd put Dreamers and Rattlesnakes in the kind of 7 out of 10 rather than the 9 out of 10. That is not a bad thing at all.
No.
I do think in terms of Vic Trenton and the Cujo references, so of course I don't think we need them. It would be a good story without them, but I do think that actually having them just adds that other layer of spice. So I do think it becomes a slightly better story because of the Cujo references. And yeah, particularly, I mean, very difficult to get into without spoiler territory, but when something happens and he inherits, let's say, something towards the end, I think, the way that he acts and receives that because of what had happened previously in his life, that's the bit that really is the connective tissue that makes the story stronger, for having the Cujo references. Didn't need it, but did make it slightly better.
Plus, I love King connections. I live for that stuff. And I will say also, it gives a shorthand to Vic's character. We know why he is the way he is. We don't have to spend pages outlining that. So that's obviously useful. But you mentioned the word inherit, and I think it's been neglected so far by most reviewers on quite what an original ghost story it is. Like the metaphysics of these ghosts, how they are, why they are, what they are, is something quite original that not a lot of people have really remarked upon. And that word inherit is like, both chilling and important in this story, and the burden of that. I think it's King's best story of haunting since perhaps 1408, and I look forward to loving it more when I reread it.
Yeah,
it could have been called The Inheritance,
and it could,
but I mean, then it sounds like some John Coyne story from 1981.
Could have called it Hand Me Downs, right? Like Hand Me Downs kids' clothes.
Yeah, that would have been a good one. Hand Me Downs.
I will say one thing as well. King told me that there is a story missing from this collection that will be in the paperback called The Music Room. And that you can read that. He published it in a magazine, and it's free to read. I can't remember what magazine it is off the top of my head. But I think, and I've read the story, and it's inspired by Norman Rockwell painting. No, is it Norman Rockwell or Jack Vetriano? Who wrote the Nighthawks? Who painted the Nighthawks?
It wasn't Rockwell.
Well, it's by that. It's based on a story. Sorry, I'm so tired I can't think of words anymore. It's based upon a painting painted by the guy who painted the Nighthawks, and it's a really
Edward Hopper.
Edward Hopper, there you go. And it's a really, it's not based on the Nighthawks, it's a different painting, but it's a chilling story that when you read it, clearly was like, then it was born. It's like the seed that Holly with the evil pensioners grew from. And that's going to be, I believe, in the paperback. So something else to look forward to when that comes out.
Interesting. Definitely want to check that out.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wonder why he held it back, or if it was a
He said he just forgot. Imagine having so many stories you can just forget one, you know.
I mean, if anyone can do it, it's going to be King, or it's going to be Stephen Graham Jones, who you mentioned earlier, or possibly Josh Malerman. And I mean, talking of Josh Malerman, and you were saying that this is an original take on a haunting. I certainly agree with you. And it just seems really serendipitous that recently, like Bob and I guess a lot of readers too, we seem to be being gifted these original takes on hauntings. I mean, Incidents Around the House, I think, has completely changed the game. This idea of inheriting a ghost in, King's story here does it again. And I know that there were some very original ideas pertaining to hauntings within a Todd Kiesling story from Cold Black and Infinite, and it is escaping my name which one that was now. I don't know if Bob is going to recall, because we spoke to Todd recently, but we've been doing this.
So did I, and I've just read that story, and I can't think which one you mean. Yeah, I wrote a story about a weird ghost. I published it years ago, and I'm not going to name it because I don't want people to find it, because it contains some things that I wouldn't write now, that I'm quite ashamed of. No, not that's going to send people. That's going to send people to try and find it.
You're channeling your grandpops in this
story.
No.
I basically I wrote this story about the ghost. It contains some quite awful fat shaming that I'm really not proud of. I wouldn't write that now at all. But I was a kid, and it's about a guy who buys a stately home and wants a ghost to populate it. So that was my offering to the annals of original ghosts. He goes to buy one. But yes, I've made that all about me. But you're quite right. There's a lot of original ghosts.
I like it though. I want to see you kind of rewrite that or reimagine it. Just taking the concept of inheriting the home and then wanting to get the ghost to to inhabit it. And even if it was a completely different story to the original, I think that idea, there's something to it. So when you're done with your other fiction projects, then that could be one to consider visiting.
I shall work it up and make it more palatable for the modern audience. I cringe when I think about some of the sentences I wrote. Anyway.
Yeah, yes. I mean, we have all made past mistakes. We all have past regrets, and dwelling on them, all it does is take away from the present joy. And there was a lot of present joy and delight within this fantastic collection. You Like It Darker. I think everyone who hasn't read it, who hasn't bought it, should go out and do that immediately. It's a fantastic King collection.
It really is. Yeah.
So good.
My greatest testament to that collection is that I have now talked about it 3 times. I did a thing on my Patreon. I did 2.5 hours of the King cast. I've done 2.5 hours with you, and I don't think I've repeated myself. Now that's not my skill. That's what's in the book. That's the potential of the book to be commended. That you can still say new things about it after like 7 hours of conversation.
Oh yeah. And I'm sure if we had another 7 hours, we could also not repeat ourselves. But good God, in 7 hours, you're meant to be at that airport. So, that is it for today. But I want to reread this collection numerous times. It's just a great book and high recommendation. Well, do you have any final thoughts? Do you have anything you would like to ask our listeners? Is there anything you'd like to promote before we let you get on your way and see you off to bed and then to Poland?
Anything I'd like to promote? No, I'm kind of slow for me at the minute. So I've done fitting to this, if you're going to come and listen to my podcast, Talking Scared, I've done many hours on King recently. I had the man himself on the podcast, and then I did 4 hours split over 2 episodes, asking some of the biggest names in horror to come and talk about their favourite short story from all of his stories. It's people like Grady Hendrix, Brian Keane, Tanana Reeve Dew talked about Rattlesnakes. Mike Flanagan came on and actually gave us an update on the Dark Tower as well, minor update. So that's a whole lot of fun, a lot of King-centric fun. And then going forwards, I'm just more and more people, basically. I've had Adam Neville, Gabino Iglesias is coming soon, Jonathan Jans, and a lot of people who are new to me. I will just tell everyone, while we're talking about short stories, forget promoting me. If you want to buy a short story collection to read this summer, check out a book called Mystery Lights by Lena Valencia, because it's wonderful. She's coming on my show soon to talk about it. It is the perfect point where literary fiction and genre horror fiction meet, and I've never been blown away by a debut collection quite like it. So forget promoting me. I'll promote Lena Valencia and Mystery Lights.
Yeah, I featured that last week on Lookout For. So I got that book on my radar.
It's fantastic, man.
Yeah, really looking forward to reading it.
It got on my radar because you put it out on Lookout For. So even though I'm the founder of This Is Horror, sometimes I don't know what's coming up. And Bob is the website manager. The podcast is kind of my domain. But yeah, now that you've said that on top of it, Neil, it's like, yeah, I want to read that collection.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's wonderful.
I will read that collection.
It's kind of like, what if New Yorker style fiction had ghosts and UFOs and weird cave dwelling creatures? You know, that's kind of what it is.
Which makes sense, because if I'm thinking correctly, it's also published by Tin House.
Tin House, yeah.
So
there you go. Yeah.
There you go. I mean, that piqued my interest initially too. It's like, wait, Tin House are putting out, a kind of horror speculative fiction collection. All right.
We're going to call it horror. Horror's not a dirty word, damn it.
Well, I because I haven't read it yet, that's why I covered my basis, the horror speculative. Like, I can't comment until I've read it to say what genre it fits into. But
I hear you.
Yeah. Is there an interview from your archive that you would like to highlight, Neil, that you want more people to hear, that you just feel they haven't listened to it, but it's a fantastic conversation, it's an author or a episode that you want to highlight?
Oh, wow. That's such a good question. And I'm so on the back foot now. I always have a spreadsheet open at all times, and I'm quickly scanning through it. What would I say was the episode that really defined? Here you go. Right, yeah. I would like everyone to go back, if they could, and listen to episode 126. I've got 205 or something now, but episode 126 is with an author called Stephen Markley, who wrote a book. It's called The Deluge, and it's in the top 5 greatest books I've ever read. Ever. And it's not even a horror novel, but it's the most terrifying book I've ever read, because it's basically about it's a fictional novel, epic 1,000-page behemoth about the next 40 years of climate change and global strife and tyranny and autocracy. And it's so terrifying and so depressing, and yet somehow in the end it leaves you with this vestige of hope. And it's one of my favourite interviews I've ever done. And Stephen's just a wonderful person to talk to. And listen to it by all means, but listen to it because you want to read the book, because that book should have won the Pulitzer. And it got a blurb off Stephen King. I asked Stephen on my show to tell people that they should buy it, and he did. And it kind of was out for 5 minutes, and then there was no chat about it, and it should have won all the awards going. Give them a Nobel Prize. It's that good. So listen to episode 126 with Stephen Markley.
All right.
Right.
We will. And maybe we got to get him on the show, see if we can give him another boost and get this on people's radars. But yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. This has been an absolute pleasure, and what an occasion, what a delight to be able to talk about You Like It Darker by Stephen King. So, Neil, thank you very much.
Well, thanks for having me. I'm sorry I've kind of slid into exhaustion towards the end. I probably started talking nonsense, but it's been a pleasure. It's been a delight. Always good to speak to you two. Always good to see you.
All right. Thank you.